The Northwest Territories covers well over 1 million square kilometers. That is bigger than Texas and Alaska combined, and most people outside Canada could not point to it on a map. Tucked into the southwest corner of that territory, along the border with the Yukon, is a river valley so remote it can only be reached by canoe or float plane. There are no roads in, no towns inside its boundaries, no permanent residents at all. Over roughly 60 years, dozens of people who ventured into it were killed or simply never came back. And of the ones who were eventually found, several were missing something specific: their heads. Today we are covering 8 verified mysteries and legends, all tied to one single place, Canada's Nahanni Valley, a location so strange that its nickname among prospectors, guides, and RCMP officers alike became Valley of the Headless Men. We will get into a hidden hot spring that spawned a lost tropical jungle legend in the middle of the subarctic, a wolf-like cryptid blamed for a string of decapitations, an entire indigenous tribe that is said to have disappeared before anyone else did, leaving its name on the valley and nothing else behind. And at number 1, the discovery that started all of it. So specific and so well documented that its details are still marked on modern park maps. Stick around for that one, because it is the story every other entry on this list gets measured against. Welcome to the channel where we dig through Canada's forgotten and unexplained corners, verify what we can, and clearly flag what we can't. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good time, because we post deep dives exactly like this one every week. Today we're counting down 8 unexplained mysteries of the Nahanni Valley. Let's get into it. Number 8. The lights nobody explained. Start with what this valley does not have. No roads, no towns, no permanent lighting of any kind for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. What it does have is some of the darkest sky left in Canada, and for decades, people flying and hiking through it have come back describing lights they could not identify. The reports go back to at least the mid-1900s. Nothing about them is centralized. Nobody filed an official report to a single agency, and nobody has ever run a formal investigation. What exists instead is a scattered trail of secondhand accounts, mostly from hikers, guides, and oddly, from scientists. Throughout the 1960s, researchers were sent into the valley to study its geology, largely untouched wilderness that had barely been surveyed. Several of them came back describing experiences they could not fully explain. Whatever they saw or thought they saw got folded straight into a mystery that was already well underway, layered on top of the decapitations and the disappearances that had been accumulating in the valley for half a century by that point. Here's the detail that complicates all of it. The same total darkness that makes this a legendary spot for unexplained lights is also, according to the same travel sources that mention the sightings, one of the best places in the country to watch the aurora borealis. No source anywhere separates the two claims. Nobody has gone through and said, this sighting was clearly the northern lights and this one was something else. It is possible every single unexplained light in the Nahanni has a perfectly ordinary explanation hanging in the same sky. It is also possible it does not. Nobody has done the work to sort it out either way. The valley is still accessible only by float plane, still without a single artificial light source for hundreds of kilometers, and still visited, seasonally, by rafters and researchers who go home with their own version of the story. The sky over Nahanni keeps doing something nobody has bothered to properly name. And at this point, more than 60 years in, it does not look like anyone is going to. Number 7. The jungle that wasn't. Picture the coldest possible version of Canada, then picture steam rising directly out of the snow in the middle of January. That is Rabbit Kettle. The hot springs here hold steady at around 20 degrees Celsius, year-round, warm enough to keep patches of bare, snow-free ground steaming through the harshest stretch of subarctic winter. Over roughly 10,000 years, mineral deposits carried up by that same spring water have built into tufa mounds, terraced formations rising about 30 meters, the tallest of their kind anywhere in the country, and the only known example of a tufa mound sitting directly on top of permafrost. Early trappers and prospectors, half frozen and moving through brutal winter conditions, stumbled onto this warm, steaming patch of ground in the middle of nowhere, and did roughly what isolated people in extreme conditions tend to do with something they cannot immediately explain. They exaggerated it. Word started to spread of a hidden tropical valley buried somewhere inside the Arctic, lush, warm, almost jungle-like, tucked past the ice where nobody else had thought to look. It was never remotely true. What is actually there is, in its own quiet way, just as strange. A microclimate created entirely by geothermal water, sustained for thousands of years, in a landscape that has no business supporting anything warm at all. Landing here still means a float plane onto Rabbit Kettle Lake, followed by a guided hike in, since the historical access points to this part of the park were limited to exactly 2 spots, Rabbit Kettle and Virginia Falls. You hear the springs before you see them, a low bubble under total wilderness silence. Here's the detail that stops most people cold. Visitors are only allowed to walk the mounds barefoot and only with a park ranger present so that 10,000 years of fragile mineral buildup does not crack under a boot heel. A tropical jungle legend and the actual rule waiting for you on site is, take your shoes off first and watch where you step. Number 6. The beast that takes heads. Long before any Europeans set foot in this valley, Dean oral tradition already described something dangerous living in its upper reaches, deep in the mountain passes and dense taiga forests that ring the river. A giant white wolf-like creature known as the Wahila, said to carry supernatural strength and a specific habit of decapitating anyone unlucky enough to cross its path. When prospectors started turning up headless a century later, the old story and the new deaths lined up closely enough that the legend took on an entirely new life. Some cryptid researchers argue the Wahila is not folklore at all, but a surviving population of the Amphicyonidae, a prehistoric bear-dog hybrid that officially went extinct millions of years ago. There is no scientific evidence supporting that. What does exist, confirmed and documented, is the Mackenzie Valley wolf, the largest subspecies of gray wolf on the planet, moving through this exact terrain in real packs, at genuinely enormous size, howling across the river canyons at twilight. Most serious researchers land here. Real wolves encountered by isolated, exhausted men in a landscape already primed for horror, exaggerated over generations of retelling into something closer to a monster. The Wahila is not the only creature threaded through the old stories either. Dean tradition also describes a weather spirit tied to the valley's worst storms, and a race of giants said to cook their meals in the same hot springs travelers now hike out to see, which tells you something about how long people out here have been trying to make sense of a place that keeps refusing to explain itself. There is no trail to any of this. You go looking for the Wahila on foot, off trail, into forest that does not care whether you find anything. The wolves are confirmed, cataloged, and photographed. The Wahila is not. Out here on the ground in the dark, most people would be forgiven for not being entirely sure which one just walked past their tent. We are only a quarter of the way through this list, and we have not reached a single confirmed human death yet. If you are finding this interesting, drop a thumbs up and tell us in the comments which of these 8 has surprised you the most so far, because we genuinely read every comment. We have got real historical cases still ahead, and from here the list only gets harder to explain away. Number 5. The people who disappeared first. The Nahanni Valley is named after a tribe that no longer exists. Before European prospectors ever set foot here, Dean oral history describes another related group called the Naha, living high in the mountains ringing the valley, distinct from the Dean living nearby, and reportedly never settled directly along the river itself. The word Naha in the Dean language translates to people from the Nahanni River Valley, and according to that same oral tradition, they disappeared entirely around the time white prospectors began arriving. Not relocated, not absorbed into a neighboring group. Simply gone, with no definitive account of why, and no archaeological remains ever conclusively tied to them. This is not a footnote buried in a fringe blog somewhere. The park's official name, Na, Adehe, translates directly to River of the Land of the Na, a people, which means this vanished tribe is baked into the actual, government-recognized name of the place, not layered on afterward by storytellers. There is one specific stretch of river tied most closely to their old territory, a narrow, deep cut through sheer canyon walls known as the 200-mile Gorge, sections of which are seasonally impassable even to modern rafting expeditions equipped with everything the Naha never had. It carries a reputation that has outlived the people it is named for by a very long time. Local guides are said to avoid entering it, not because of a marked hazard sign or a documented hazard at all, but because Dean tradition describes an unknown evil living there, and even now, that is reason enough for people who know the valley well to stay out. 100 years of gold rush deaths, decapitations, and cryptid sightings all get layered on top of a mystery that came first and predates every other story on this list by generations. An entire people disappeared from this valley before it had prospectors, before it had a park boundary, before it even carried the name it carries today. Multi-day canoe or raft travel is still the only way in, the same route the Naha themselves would have used, moving through a gorge that still echoes every sound of the current back off its own walls. Nobody explained their disappearance either. The gorge is still there, still named, still avoided by some. The people it is named for are not. Number 4. The Woman on the Cliff. In 1926, a woman named Annie Laferte was out hunting with a small party in the Nahanni backcountry, dense forest thickening into steep scree slopes, when something happened that nobody in her group could later explain. Witnesses described her running and screaming into the woods, tearing off her own clothing as she went, and she did not stop. She did not return to camp that night or any night after. Search efforts through the surrounding forest turned up nothing. No trail, no camp, no sign of where she had gone. Months later, an indigenous man named Big Charlie reported seeing her again, climbing a nearly vertical cliff face, naked, apparently out of her mind, moving up the rock with no visible fear of falling. That sighting is the last confirmed record of her. No trace was ever found afterward. No cause of her initial breakdown was ever established, then or since. This is not a gold story. There is no motive of greed here, no rival prospector waiting in the trees, no lost mine anyone was chasing. Just a woman, a sudden and witnessed collapse into what looked, to everyone watching, like total panic, and a final sighting that does not fit easily into any ordinary explanation. Laferte's case sits apart from almost everything else on this list for exactly that reason. There is no curse story built around her. No creature gets blamed. No treasure legend grew out of what happened to her. Just a documented breakdown, a witness account of a scene that should not have been physically possible on that slope, and then nothing. No memorial marks the place where she was last seen. No plaque, no named creek, nothing carried forward the way the McLeod story eventually was. Her disappearance survives only in a handful of written secondhand accounts, repeated by people who still, a century later, do not know what they actually watched happen. Of everything on this list, hers may be the hardest one to sit with, precisely because there is no explanation waiting at the end of it, not even a false one. Number 3. The Outlaw Who Followed the Curse. By 1927, the story of the McLeod brothers and their lost gold claim had already been circulating through northern camps for 2 decades, and it kept pulling people back into the valley. One of them was a man known as Yukon Fisher, a fugitive who had fled an assault charge and taken refuge deep in Nahanni country. He was found dead in almost the exact same location where the McLeods had died 20 years earlier, decapitated. His camp burned down around him. The RCMP officers who eventually reached the site found his rifle warped from heat, which tells you the fire that consumed his camp was neither small nor accidental. In the weeks leading up to his death, Fisher had reportedly been spending gold freely, gold that was never traced back to any known claim, his own or anyone else's. Whatever its source, it bought him almost nothing in the end. No suspect was ever named. No formal investigation went anywhere conclusive. The location, the method, the fire, the missing head, all of it mirrors the McLeod case closely enough that it stopped reading like coincidence to the people actually living out there and started reading like a pattern instead. That is usually the exact moment a story stops being something people tell around a fire at night and starts being something people quietly plan their route around during the day. The riverside clearing where Fisher's camp once stood sits in dense boreal forest, reachable only by multi-day river travel from the nearest settlement, and nothing of the camp itself survives there today. Fisher was not, by most accounts, someone who believed in any curse. He went looking for gold in exactly the wrong stretch of river at exactly the wrong time, and the valley handed him the same ending it had handed the McLeod brothers 2 decades before. A fugitive hiding from one kind of danger walked directly into another, and nobody has ever explained what that second danger actually was. Number 2. The man who tried to stay. Every other prospector on this list was passing through. Martin Jorgensen was the one who decided to stay. Sometime in the 1910s, he built an actual cabin near the mouth of the Flat River, not a temporary camp meant to be abandoned by spring, but a real structure, intended to last through multiple seasons in a place almost nobody else was willing to commit to for more than a few weeks at a time. The written record on exactly who he was does not fully agree. One account describes him as Swiss, arriving and dying within the same year. Another describes him as Norwegian, arriving around 1910 and found roughly 5 years later. We are flagging that discrepancy directly rather than picking one version and presenting it as settled, because it isn't. What both accounts do agree on is what actually happened to him. His cabin burned to the ground. His body was found nearby, in the ashes and wreckage of that same structure. His head was gone, and despite a search of the surrounding riverbank, it was never recovered. His death came roughly a decade after the McLeod brothers were found, and it changed the shape of the story in a way their case alone had not managed. One decapitation, however brutal, can still be explained away as an isolated tragedy, a single act of violence with a single unknown cause. A second one, a decade later, at a different site, involving a man who had done nothing the McLeods had done, chasing no rumor, working no claim, simply trying to live there, is a much harder thing to wave off as coincidence. It is the point where a story stops being one bad night in the wilderness and starts being a pattern with a body count. Jorgensen was not passing through chasing a rumor of gold, the way most of the men on this list were. He was betting on permanence, a cabin instead of a tent, a homestead instead of a camp, in a place where almost nobody else was willing to stay long enough to call it home. The riverbank clearing where his cabin once stood is unmarked today, accessible only by boat travel up the Flat River, and nothing of the structure remains. Here's the detail that separates his case from every other one on this list. He is the only victim here who was not just moving through. He tried to build something that would outlast a single season, and the valley took his head anyway, in the same manner, with the same total absence of explanation as it had taken the McLeods before him and would go on to take Fisher after. It confirmed something that people living out there had already started to suspect. This place did not care whether you were a stranger passing through or a resident who intended to stay for good. Number 1. The Valley of the Headless Men. Picture the canyon walls first, because everything else about this place comes second. On either side of you, sheer rock rises roughly 1,000 meters, high enough to block direct sunlight for most of the day, funneling the sound of the river into a kind of echo chamber that never fully goes quiet, even at night. You arrive by canoe because there is no other way in, days from the nearest settlement of any kind, with a float plane as your only realistic option if something goes wrong out here. The forest floor along the river is boreal, dense, quiet in the specific way that only total isolation produces. And on the modern park map, sitting inside all of that, are 3 names that were not chosen lightly: Headless Creek, Deadmen Valley, the Funeral Range. Somebody named all 3 of those places on purpose, deliberately, and they did it more than a century ago based on something they had actually found. Here is how that happened. In 1906, 2 brothers of Métis ancestry, Willie and Frank McLeod, canoed upriver into the Nahanni, chasing a gold claim they had already proven once before. On an earlier trip, they had struck a modest amount of real gold and come home with physical proof of it, which was more than enough to convince them and everyone who heard the story afterward that something larger was waiting deeper in the canyons ahead. They went back in, this time with an engineer named Weir accompanying them. None of the 3 men were ever seen alive again. 2 years passed before their own brother, Charlie, finally organized and led a search party into the valley to find them. What he found was a burned-out camp on the riverbank and 2 skeletons lying inside it, both of them headless. One body was positioned with an arm outstretched toward a gun, as though he had woken suddenly to a threat and reached for a weapon he never actually got to use. Weir was never found at all. Not a trace of him, not then, and not in the centuries since. No suspect was ever identified. No investigation, official or otherwise, has ever produced an answer for what happened at that campsite. Word of what Charlie found spread through the northern camps almost immediately, and it did not stay a simple tragedy for very long. Within the retelling, it became something closer to a treasure map. Rumors grew of a hidden mother lode buried somewhere past the second canyon, guarded, depending on who was telling the story, by whatever had taken the brothers' heads in the first place. Prospectors kept pushing into the valley for decades afterward, chasing a claim that has never once been located, and people are still occasionally drawn in looking for it today, more than 100 years later. The only physical evidence that any of it ever existed is two headless skeletons and a story that, for whatever reason, has simply refused to die. This is the case the entire valley is named for, and it is the reason every other mystery on this list gets measured against it. The disappearances, the cryptid, the strange lights over the canyons, the vanished tribe whose name the river itself still carries, all of it sits in the shadow of what Charlie McLeod found at that campsite in 1908. Because this is the one story with an actual body count, a burned camp you can point to, a missing companion who was never recovered, and a piece of geography that still carries the family's history in its name. Headless Creek and Deadman Valley are not metaphors invented for a documentary. They are the real names on the real map of a place still passed today by rafting expeditions who paddle straight through the exact stretch of river where none of this was ever explained. Nobody ever came back with an answer. The creek just kept the name, and more than 100 years on, that is still all anyone really has. 8 verified mysteries, and not one of them required us to invent a single detail to make the valley interesting. It was already like this before we got here. For me, it is the McLeod brothers, 2 names still sitting on a modern map, a burned camp, and a mystery that has outlived everyone who was ever there to solve it. That is the one that stays with you after the screen goes dark. Which of these 8 got to you the most, and is there a Nahanni story we missed that deserves a closer look? Tell us in the comments. If you want more deep dives into Canada's forgotten and unexplained corners, subscribe because we post one every single week.